In the winter of 1858, something happened on a plantation outside Charleston that the family tried desperately to hide. A master dead over the course of months, a young woman accused, and a story so dark that even the courts struggled to decide what justice looked like when the victim had been a monster. If stories about the terrible arithmetic of survival matter to you, about what happens when the abused finally stop accepting their abuse, then stay with me. Because what happened to Eliza tells you everything you need to know about how far a person can be pushed before something inside them breaks beyond repair. Magnolia Grove Plantation sat on 2,800 acres of prime South Carolina lowlands, where the soil was rich and the rice grew thick in flooded fields. By 1858, it was one of the most profitable plantations in the state. Owned by the Whitmore family for 3 generations, the current master was Edmund Whitmore, 43 years old, twice widowed, childless, and according to Charleston society, a gentleman of the highest order. He attended the right church, contributed to the right charities, spoke eloquently about Southern values and the burden of civilizing an inferior race. Behind closed doors, Edmund Whitmore was something else entirely. Eliza came to Magnolia Grove in 1850, when she was 8 years old. She'd been born on a smaller plantation that went bankrupt, and when the assets were sold off, she was purchased by Whitmore, along with her mother, Ruth. The bill of sale listed them together. One Negro woman, Ruth, age 28, field hand. One Negro girl, Eliza, age 8. House servant potential. That last phrase, house servant potential, would determine the course of Eliza's life in ways no 8-year-old could possibly understand. Ruth was sent to work in the rice fields, brutal labor that involved standing in water up to your waist while planting and harvesting. The work destroyed people. If the physical strain didn't break you, the malaria or snake bites or accidents would. Eliza was kept at the big house. Initially, she worked in the kitchen, helping the cook, learning to serve meals and clean rooms. The work was hard but relatively safe compared to field labor. For the first 2 years, Eliza's life at Magnolia Grove was difficult but bearable. She saw her mother on Sundays. She learned quickly, worked hard, stayed out of trouble. The cook, an older woman named Martha, looked out for her, taught her not just how to work, but how to survive. "Keep your head down," Martha would tell her. "Don't never look Master Whitmore in the eye. Don't never be alone with him if you can help it. And if you can't help it, scream. Scream loud enough that other folks come running." Eliza didn't understand at first. She was 10 years old, and Master Whitmore had never paid her much attention beyond the occasional command or correction. Then her mother died. Ruth caught a fever working in the flooded rice fields. One day she was fine, the next she was burning up, and 3 days later she was gone. They buried her in the slave cemetery beyond the fields, a simple wooden marker with no name. Eliza was 10 years old and alone. That's when Edmund Whitmore's attention shifted to her. It started small. He'd find reasons to call Eliza to his study. Ask her to bring him coffee, to dust the shelves, to organize papers. Nothing inappropriate, at least not at first. Just attention. More attention than a master usually paid to a child slave. Martha noticed. She started trying to keep Eliza busy with other tasks, to ensure she was always with other people, never alone. But Martha was old and tired, and she couldn't be everywhere. The first time Whitmore touched Eliza inappropriately, She was 11 years old. He called her to his study to clean, and when she was reaching up to dust a high shelf, he came up behind her and put his hands on her waist. "You're growing up," he said, "becoming quite pretty." Eliza froze. Every instinct told her this was wrong, dangerous. But what could she do? Run? To where? Tell someone? Who would believe her over a white master? So she did what Martha had taught her. She made a noise, dropped the duster, gasped loudly, created enough commotion that the housekeeper came to check what was wrong. Whitmore stepped back, annoyed, but not angry. "Clumsy girl," he muttered, and dismissed her. But Eliza knew it would happen again. Over the next year, Whitmore's behavior escalated. He'd find excuses to touch her, adjusting her collar, brushing against her in hallways, letting his hand linger on her shoulder when giving instructions. Each time, Eliza would try to create distance, try to ensure she wasn't alone with him. It became a terrible game. Whitmore would seek opportunities. Eliza would try to avoid them. Martha and the other house slaves would try to protect her without being obvious about it, because openly acknowledging what was happening would force Whitmore to either stop or escalate, and no one wanted to risk the latter. When Eliza was 12, Whitmore called her to his bedroom, said he needed help organizing his wardrobe. When she entered, he locked the door behind her. What happened next is what happened to countless enslaved girls throughout the South. Eliza tried to resist. Whitmore overpowered her easily. She was 12 years old, maybe 90 pounds. He was a grown man, over 6 feet tall, strong. Afterward, he gave her a ribbon for her hair, told her this was their special secret, said that if she told anyone, he'd have Martha whipped and sold south, and it would be Eliza's fault. Eliza stumbled back to the kitchen in shock. Martha took one look at her and knew. She cleaned Eliza up, held her while she cried, and whispered words that were supposed to be comforting but weren't. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. But you got to survive this. You got to be strong." How do you survive something like that? How do you be strong when the person who owns you treats you like property in the most literal, violating way possible? Eliza didn't know, but she learned. The abuse became routine. Once a week, sometimes more. Whitmore would summon Eliza to his private quarters. She'd go because refusing meant punishment for everyone she cared about. He'd use her body however he wanted. Then he'd send her away with some small gift, a piece of candy, a nice fabric for a dress, once even a book. These gifts were part of his delusion. Whitmore genuinely believed he was being kind, that he was showing favoritism to Eliza. In his mind, the abuse was a form of special attention, not the violent crime it actually was. Eliza learned to disconnect during these encounters, to let her mind go somewhere else, while her body remained behind. She'd imagined she was with her mother, or that she was free, or that she was anyone, anywhere else. The other house slaves knew what was happening. They couldn't not know. Eliza would emerge from Whitmore's chambers with that particular deadness in her eyes, that blank expression that victims of repeated trauma develop as a defense mechanism. But no one could stop it. Speaking up would only bring punishment. Even if they reported it to authorities, who would care? Enslaved girls had no legal protection from their masters. Rape wasn't a crime if the victim was property. So Eliza endured. 12 became 13. 13 became 14. The abuse continued, relentless and routine, and something inside Eliza began to change. At first, it was just a small kernel of rage, a tiny spark of anger that she kept buried deep because letting it show would be dangerous. But over months and years, that spark grew. Fed by every violation, every humiliation, every night she lay awake in the servant quarters, feeling dirty and broken and powerless. The rage grew until it was all that kept her alive. Because if she didn't have anger to hold on to, she'd have nothing but despair, and despair would kill her faster than any disease. By the time Eliza was 15, she'd developed a skill that would prove useful later. She'd learned to hide what she was thinking. Could stand in front of Whitmore with a pleasant, neutral expression, while inside her mind screamed with hatred. Could serve him dinner, pour his wine, adjust his pillows, all while fantasizing about his death in increasingly creative ways. She became two people. The outer Eliza, who was obedient and quiet and perfectly submissive, and the inner Eliza, who was calculating his murder. At first, these fantasies were just that, fantasies, a way to cope, to maintain some sense of agency, even in complete powerlessness. She'd imagine poison in his food, a blade in the dark, his body broken at the bottom of the stairs. But gradually, the fantasies became plans, more detailed, more practical, more possible. Eliza began to pay attention differently. She noticed what Whitmore ate and drank, when he took medication, what made him ill. She observed the household routines, who went where and when, what could go unnoticed. She also noticed something else. Whitmore's health was declining. He'd always been robust, but by 1856 he was developing problems, digestive issues, headaches, fatigue. He complained constantly about feeling unwell. His personal physician, Dr. Harrison, visited regularly, prescribed various tonics and medicines, told Whitmore he was working too hard, needed more rest, should adjust his diet. Eliza, who often served Whitmore his meals and prepared his medicines, listened to all of this with great interest. In the summer of 1856, Martha died. She was old, worn out, and one morning she simply didn't wake up. They buried her next to Ruth in the slave cemetery. Eliza was 16 years old and had now lost both people who'd tried to protect her. She felt more alone than ever, more vulnerable, more desperate. That's when the planning shifted from fantasy to reality. The cook who replaced Martha was a woman named Bessie, younger and less attentive to the dynamics of the household. She didn't notice when Eliza took extra time preparing Whitmore's food, didn't pay attention to what Eliza added to his coffee or his soup. Eliza started small, a bit too much salt in his food, enough to worsen his digestive problems, but not enough to be suspicious. She'd prepare his evening toddy with slightly spoiled milk, mix his morning coffee with water that had been sitting too long. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would point to poisoning. Just small, consistent acts that would make his existing health problems worse. Whitmore's condition deteriorated. He was sick more often, tired all the time, unable to keep food down. Dr. Harrison visited more frequently, prescribed different medicines, but nothing seemed to help. "It's your digestion, Edmund," the doctor said. "You're not getting proper nutrition. Your body is failing to absorb nutrients." If only he knew that Eliza was ensuring Whitmore's food was contaminated with small amounts of substances that caused exactly those symptoms. Herbs from the garden that caused stomach upset, oils that interfered with digestion, nothing immediately toxic, but cumulatively devastating. The plantation's overseer suggested that perhaps it was the food itself. Maybe the cook was incompetent. But when others ate the same meals with no problems, that theory was abandoned. Eliza was beyond suspicion. She was just a teenage girl, quiet and obedient, who'd served in the household for years. Why would anyone suspect her? By early 1857, Whitmore was seriously ill. He'd lost significant weight, was weak and irritable, spent most of his time in bed. He could no longer assault Eliza regularly, didn't have the strength or stamina. That alone was worth every risk she was taking. But Eliza didn't stop. She couldn't. This wasn't just about ending the abuse anymore. It was about justice, about making him pay for 6 years of violations, for her mother's death, for the life she'd never get to live, because he'd destroyed her childhood. She began to be more aggressive, added stronger substances to his food, crushed seeds from plants that were mildly toxic, mixed tinctures that would cause severe cramping and vomiting. Whitmore's health collapsed. By summer of 1857, he was bedridden. Dr. Harrison was baffled. He ran tests, tried different treatments, consulted with other physicians. No one could determine what was wrong. "It's like his body is slowly shutting down," Harrison told Whitmore's concerned cousins who'd come to visit. "I've never seen anything quite like it. Every organ system seems to be failing simultaneously." The cousins suggested bringing in a specialist from Charleston. A new doctor arrived, conducted a thorough examination, and concluded the same thing. Whitmore was dying from some mysterious wasting disease. No one suspected murder. Why would they? Slaves couldn't poison their masters without being caught. Everyone knew that. The masters controlled the food supply, watched for signs of rebellion, punished even the hint of resistance. Except Eliza had been so patient, so careful, so subtle, that she'd created the perfect crime. A death that looked natural because it happened slowly over months, with symptoms that mimicked common diseases. Through all of this, Eliza continued to serve Whitmore, brought him meals, poisoned, gave him his medicine, mixed with substances that counteracted its effects, sat by his bedside when he was too weak to be alone, and thought about finishing him more quickly but decided slow was better. Whitmore, delirious and sick, sometimes apologized to her. In his fevered state, he'd cry and say he was sorry for hurting her, that he knew what he'd done was wrong, that he hoped God would forgive him. Eliza would nod and say soothing words, while internally screaming that God wouldn't forgive him. She wouldn't forgive him, and he was getting exactly what he deserved. By October 1857, Whitmore was barely conscious. His body had been systematically destroyed from the inside out. Organs damaged, systems failing, immune response compromised. He looked like a skeleton covered in yellowing skin. Dr. Harrison prepared the family for the end. "It's a matter of days, perhaps hours. Make your peace." The family gathered. They prayed. They held vigil. And they thanked the servants, including Eliza, for their dedicated care during Edmund's long illness. Eliza stood in the corner of the bedroom, watching Whitmore die by inches, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. He died on October 23, 1857, at 3 a.m. The official cause of death was listed as wasting sickness of unknown origin. Eliza was 17 years old. She'd spent 6 years being raped by this man, and she'd spent the last year and a half killing him so slowly that no one suspected murder. For a few months after Whitmore's death, Eliza thought she'd gotten away with it. The plantation passed to his cousin, a man named Richard Whitmore, who lived in Charleston and had no interest in daily operations. He hired a new overseer and largely left things alone. Eliza was reassigned to field work, which was harder physically, but meant she no longer had to work in the big house, no longer had to be near the room where she'd been assaulted repeatedly. She thought her nightmare was over. Then Richard Whitmore decided to sell some of the estate's assets. He hired an appraiser to inventory the house and came across Edmund's diary. Edmund had kept detailed journals, something Richard hadn't known. The journals covered decades and included extensive notes about plantation management, financial records, and personal observations, including observations about Eliza. Richard read entries where Edmund described taking Eliza, using her, treating her as his personal property in the most literal sense. The entries were explicit, disgusting, and completely incriminating. They also included something else: Edmund's growing suspicion in his final months that something was wrong with his food. "I wonder," he'd written in August 1857, "if my illness is natural, or if someone wishes me harm. But who would dare? And how? I eat what everyone eats, drink what everyone drinks. Perhaps I am paranoid from the sickness." Richard Whitmore read all of this with growing horror and rage. Horror at what his cousin had done to a child. Rage that someone might have killed him for it. He called the sheriff. The investigation was cursory. The sheriff questioned the household staff, most of whom protected Eliza by claiming they'd seen nothing unusual. But Bessie, the cook, mentioned that Eliza had often prepared Whitmore's special meals separately because of his dietary restrictions. That was enough for the sheriff to arrest Eliza on suspicion of murder. The trial began in January 1858. Eliza was 18 years old, facing a courtroom full of white men who would decide her fate. The prosecution's case was circumstantial but compelling. They established that Eliza had access to Whitmore's food. They showed the journal entries proving she had motive, though they had to carefully dance around the fact that the motive was 6 years of rape. They brought in physicians who testified that the symptoms Whitmore experienced could be consistent with poisoning. They couldn't prove what specific poison had been used or present any direct evidence that Eliza had poisoned anyone. But in 1858, South Carolina, proof wasn't really necessary. The question wasn't whether she'd done it, but whether she'd be punished for it. Eliza didn't have a lawyer. Enslaved people weren't entitled to legal representation. She was allowed to speak in her own defense, which surprised everyone when she chose to do so. The prosecutor asked her directly, "Did you poison Edmund Whitmore?" Eliza looked at the jury, 12 white men who'd probably never seen an enslaved woman as fully human. She thought about lying, about denying everything. Then she thought about Edmund Whitmore's hands on her body, his breath on her neck, 6 years of powerlessness and pain. "Yes," she said, "I killed him." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel for order. "I killed him slowly," Eliza continued, her voice steady. "I put things in his food that made him sick. I did it every day for more than a year. I watched him waste away, and I was glad." "Why?" the prosecutor demanded. "Why would you do such a thing?" Eliza looked directly at him. "Because he raped me," starting when I was 12 years old. He raped me 3 times a week for 6 years. He owned my body, and he used it however he wanted. And I couldn't stop him, couldn't fight him, couldn't run from him. So I killed him the only way I could, slowly, carefully, so no one would know. Dead silence in the courtroom. "Did you not think about the consequences?" the prosecutor asked. "Every day," Eliza replied. "Every single day. I knew if I was caught I'd be killed. But I was dying anyway, just slower. He was killing me piece by piece, taking everything that made me human. So I decided if I was going to die, he was going to die first." The prosecutor had no response to that. What could he say? That she should have just accepted being raped? That she had no right to defend herself? That her body didn't belong to her, so she couldn't protest its violation? He couldn't say any of that out loud. So instead he said, "Murder is murder, regardless of the reason." "Then I'm a murderer," Eliza said calmly, "and I'd do it again." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. They found her guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. But something unexpected happened between the conviction and the execution. The story spread. Newspapers picked it up, not the big papers, but smaller publications, abolition-leaning journals, religious newsletters. They printed excerpts from Edmund Whitmore's diary. They printed Eliza's testimony. They asked questions. Is it murder when a girl defends herself against her rapist in the only way available to her? Does she owe obedience to a man who treats her as property? Where is the crime? In the killing or in the raping? Northern abolitionists seized on the case as proof that slavery was fundamentally immoral. How could a system be just if it provided no protection for children, no recourse for rape victims, no acknowledgement that enslaved people had any rights at all? Southern plantation owners countered that the case proved slaves were dangerous and needed strict control, that any leniency would lead to more murders. The debate raged for weeks. Meanwhile, Eliza sat in jail, waiting to die. Then something truly unexpected happened. The governor received a petition signed by 200 women, white women, mostly from the North, but some from South Carolina, asking him to commute Eliza's sentence. They argued that she'd acted in self-defense against a sexual predator, that she deserved mercy, that executing her would be a travesty of justice. The governor was in an impossible position. He couldn't pardon Eliza without angering white Southerners who saw her as a dangerous example. But executing her would give ammunition to abolitionists and make South Carolina look barbaric. He chose a compromise. He commuted Eliza's sentence from execution to life imprisonment at hard labor. She'd be transferred to a prison work camp and spend the rest of her life in chains. It wasn't mercy. It was just a different kind of death sentence. But it was slightly better than hanging. Before Eliza was transferred, a journalist from a Boston newspaper managed to visit her in jail. He asked if she felt any remorse for killing Edmund Whitmore. "No," Eliza said. "I feel regret that I couldn't kill him faster. I feel anger that he died surrounded by family who mourned him, when he deserved to die alone and afraid like he made me feel every night for 6 years. I feel sadness that I'm the one in chains when he's the one who committed crimes. But remorse? No, I don't have that. Do you believe God will forgive you?" "I don't know, but I know God won't forgive him. And if we both end up in hell, at least he'll be there too, and I'll get to watch him burn for eternity." The journalist published this interview. It became one of the most widely read pieces about the case. Some readers were horrified by Eliza's lack of remorse. Others were moved by her raw honesty, her refusal to perform the penitence that white society expected. Eliza was transferred to a prison work camp in the spring of 1858. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners were worked like slaves, but with even less concern for their survival, since the state had no financial interest in keeping them alive long-term. Eliza lasted 3 years. She died in 1861, at age 21. From pneumonia contracted while working in a quarry in winter conditions with inadequate clothing. She was buried in an unmarked grave at the prison. No one attended her funeral. No record was made of her passing beyond a notation in the prison ledger. Prisoner Number 347, female, Negro, deceased. But her story didn't die. Years later, after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, historians and journalists began combing through records of the antebellum period. They found Eliza's case in court archives, found the newspaper articles, found Edmund Whitmore's diary. The diary became particularly important. Here was a white master's own written confession of repeatedly raping an enslaved child. Here was proof, in his own hand, of the kind of abuse that abolitionists had described, but Southern apologists had denied. The diary was published in an academic journal in 1879. It caused a renewed scandal. People who defended slavery were forced to confront this explicit evidence of its depravity. Eliza's case was studied as an example of resistance, of the ways enslaved people fought back when direct rebellion was impossible. She couldn't run, couldn't physically overpower her abuser, couldn't appeal to authorities for help, so she used the only weapon available: patience and poison. Was it murder? Legally, yes. Morally? That's the question historians still debate. Some argue that Eliza was a victim who snapped and committed a crime. Others argue that she was a soldier in a war, fighting the only battle she could fight. Still others argue that the concept of murder doesn't apply when the victim was actively committing ongoing crimes against the accused. What's not debatable is the cost. Eliza's childhood was stolen, her body was violated repeatedly, her humanity was denied. And when she finally fought back, the system punished her for daring to defend herself. In 1935, 77 years after Eliza's trial, a historian named Margaret Foster tracked down descendants of the people who'd been enslaved at Magnolia Grove. She was writing a book about resistance during slavery and wanted first-hand accounts from people whose families had experienced it. One elderly woman, whose grandmother had been at Magnolia Grove during Eliza's time, shared a story that had been passed down through the family. "My grandmother said Eliza was the bravest person she ever knew," the woman told Foster. "Not because she poisoned Master Whitmore. Anyone could understand that. But because she stood up in that courtroom and told the truth, didn't lie, didn't apologize, didn't beg for mercy, just said what happened and accepted the consequences." Did your grandmother think what Eliza did was right? She thought what Master Whitmore did was wrong, and she thought Eliza did what she had to do. Right or wrong don't really apply when you're not treated as human. You just survive however you can. That interview became part of Foster's book, which was one of the first academic works to seriously examine resistance by enslaved women. Eliza's case was featured prominently as an example of how powerless people find power in unexpected ways. Today, there's no marker for Eliza's grave. The prison where she died was demolished decades ago, and the burial ground was paved over. Nothing physical remains of her existence except court records, newspaper clippings, and Edmund Whitmore's damning diary. But her story remains, told in classrooms, studied in universities, debated in discussions about justice and resistance. The girl who was raped for 6 years and killed her rapist slowly. The woman who chose death over continued submission. The prisoner who refused to apologize for defending herself. Some people find the story disturbing. It should be disturbing. It's about a child being systematically brutalized, and a system that not only allowed it, but punished her when she fought back. Others find it inspiring. A reminder that even in the most oppressive circumstances, even when all obvious forms of resistance are impossible, people find ways to fight. Maybe not ways that succeed, maybe not ways that save them, but ways that assert their humanity and their refusal to be completely broken. The image of Eliza, young, dark-skinned, with that rope of abuse around her neck metaphorically for years, before it would be literally placed there as punishment, represents thousands of enslaved girls whose stories were never told, who were abused in silence, who died without ever getting justice, whose names are lost to history. Eliza's name survived only because she fought back, because she made her oppressor pay, because she refused to suffer quietly. That's a complicated legacy. We want our heroes to be purely good, to resist in ways that align with modern morality. But Eliza was desperate, traumatized, and trapped. She did what she felt she had to do with the limited options available to her. Was it cruel? Yes. Whitmore died slowly, painfully, confused and frightened. But then, Eliza had been dying slowly for 6 years, not physically at first, but spiritually, mentally, emotionally. Piece by piece, he'd killed who she was supposed to become. The cruelest revenge, the title suggests. But from another perspective, it was simply reciprocal justice. He took years from her. She took his remaining years from him. He caused her daily pain. She caused him daily pain. He showed no mercy. She showed no mercy. It's a dark arithmetic. But under slavery, it was the only arithmetic available to people like Eliza. So what do you think? Was Eliza a murderer or a victim? Was her act revenge or self-defense? Should she have been punished or praised? The answers to these questions reveal more about us than about her. Because how we judge Eliza says something about how we understand power, oppression, and the limits of human endurance. If you believe these stories matter, the uncomfortable ones, the ones that don't have easy moral answers, then remember Eliza. Remember that she was 12 years old when the abuse started. Remember that she had no legal recourse, no protection, no way out. Remember that when she finally fought back, the system punished her for refusing to be a perfect victim. Remember her age, her circumstances, her choices. Remember that she lived 21 years, and most of them were pain. Remember that she's buried in an unmarked grave, unnamed and unmourned by the society that destroyed her. And remember that there were thousands like her. Girls and women whose abuse never made it into any diary, whose resistance never resulted in trials, whose stories were buried with them in unmarked graves. Eliza's story survived by accident. How many didn't? How many acts of resistance, desperate measures taken by desperate people, were successfully hidden by the powerful? How many poisonings went undetected? How many accidents weren't accidents? How many mysterious deaths were actually quiet rebellions? We'll never know. History is written by the powerful, and they don't document their own vulnerabilities. But sometimes, like with Eliza, the truth slips through, and we're left with a story that's uncomfortable, complicated, and absolutely necessary to understand. America's cruelest revenge, or maybe just America's clearest example of what happens when you build a system on cruelty and expect the crushed to never crush back. The rope around her neck, first metaphorical, then literal, represents both her oppression and her punishment for resisting that oppression. She wore chains from birth. She just chose when and how they would end. That's not a happy ending, but it's an honest one. And sometimes truth matters more than comfort. Remember Eliza. Remember what was done to her. Remember what she did in response. Remember that the system called her the criminal while protecting her abuser until she made that protection impossible. Remember, because these stories, the dark ones, the complicated ones, the ones that make us question our assumptions about justice, are the stories that most need telling. She was abused for years. She killed him slowly. And whether you call it murder or mercy, whether you condemn or understand, you can't ignore the fundamental truth. This is what slavery was. This is what it did to people. This is the legacy we still carry. That's America's cruelest revenge. Not what Eliza did to Whitmore, but what the system did to both of them, turning one into a monster and the other into someone who had to become cruel to survive. Remember her name, Eliza. One girl among thousands, but the one whose story made it into the records. The one we can still see, still learn from, still mourn. That has to mean something. That has to matter. Tell her story. Make sure she's not forgotten. Because forgetting would be the final cruelty. To let her suffering be erased, her resistance be dismissed, her humanity be denied one more time. She deserves better. They all deserved better. And we owe them at least the honesty of remembering.